Chapter 7, The Man on the Wall. When Miss Husey read the piece of writing aloud at the end of the week, there was a shuffling and looking around for who seemed embarrassed or who looked too pleased. A strange chair? Modern art with things hanging from it? Does the writer want to stay anonymous, or do you want to tell us what this is? Miss Husey asked after several guesses had been made. Silence. Petra cleared her throat. Well, it's a special book. Petra thought suddenly of the calm, intelligent woman in her dream, the woman in the yellow jacket. She probably never had to explain her writing. And suddenly Petra felt the woman was sort of keeping her company, whispering, "It doesn't matter what they say. I understand." "A book?" snorted Denise. "Berries and smelly pants?" Petra's mouth closed in a tight line. Miss Husey turned toward Denise. "Yes, unexpected similes can carry the power of surprise. They're refreshing, aren't they?" Denise looked as if she had smelled something bad. Calder was impressed by Petra's writing and wished it were his own. An hour later, in the cafeteria, he spotted Petra in a corner by herself. He decided to join her. He wanted to tell her about the 3 people outside his house yesterday, and how much he liked her description. He was imagining how surprised Petra would be to have his company. It was then that Calder's lunchbox collided with the back of a chair and popped open. Petra heard the bang and watched his bologna sandwich, now airborne, cross the table with impressive speed. By the time Calder retrieved his sandwich and sat down, she had begun to laugh. All right, Calder said. "It's just that I was reading about inexplicable loud noises and things falling from the sky. Then there was this whop, and then a flying..." She was gasping. "It's not you. It's just so perfect." "What are you reading?" "The book I wrote about. I found it at Powell's yesterday." Calder saw that it said "Low" on the spine. Weird title. No wonder she was trying to cover it up. "It's by this guy, Charles Fort, who spent a lot of his life looking for newspaper articles about unexplained stuff," Petra said. "You know, like weird lights in the sky, objects traveling through rooms without any visible explanation, ghosts, crazy things like that. He talks about how blind and idiotic he thinks a lot of our education is. And he's funny. He doesn't take anyone's thinking too seriously, including his own." She paused, surprised at herself for saying so much. "I love hearing about people who figure things out for themselves. Plus, I love to think about things that no one understands. Yet." Calder's mouth was full. "Almost anywhere you look in here, there's something amazing. Listen to this." Petra flipped to the middle of the book. "There have been many mysterious disappearances of human beings." Chicago Tribune, January 5th, 1900. Sherman Church, a young man employed in the Augusta Mills, Battle Creek, Michigan, has disappeared. He was seated in the company's office when he arose and ran into the mill. He has not been seen since. The mill has been almost taken to pieces by the searchers, and the river, woods, and country have been scoured. And then records of 6 persons who between January 14th, 1920 and December 9th, 1923 were found wandering in or near the small town of Rumford, Essex, England, unable to tell how they got there or anything else about themselves. Calder had stopped chewing and was staring at her. "Tommy knows a kid called Frog, a kid in New York who just disappeared." "Frog?" Petra started to laugh again. "A flying frog?" Calder kind of wanted to laugh too, but the news wasn't supposed to be funny. What was she talking about anyway? "Do you believe this guy Fort?" As soon as Calder said it, he wished he hadn't. It wasn't really what he meant. Petra's face closed and she looked disappointed. "Well, part of what is so neat is that he worked from newspapers. I know most people would think this was completely stupid. Abruptly, Petra started to gather her things, stuffing low into her lunch bag. This wasn't going well. Calder did understand Petra's excitement. It was just that he hadn't wanted to look like an idiot again. Plus, the frog connection had been such a weird coincidence. Before Petra could get up, he blurted, "Your writing was great, and I also saw Miss Husey, an old lady called Mrs. Sharp, and Mr. Watch, my boss from Powell's, outside my house yesterday. They were all there together." Petra no longer looked unfriendly. "Mrs. who?" "Sharp. At least that's what it sounded like." Petra pulled out her book again. She opened to the first page and turned it toward Calder. "Strange, huh?" "Louise Coffin Sharp," Calder read. "Do you think that's her? I could find out," he said as if there was nothing to it. "Okay," Petra beamed at him. "Thanks. I'd love to know. I didn't think the first owner would still be alive." The next day was Saturday, and Calder arrived at Powell's early. Mr. Watch was seated behind the front counter, frowning over what looked like a letter. "Ah, yes, I need you to make a delivery." Mr. Watch refolded the letter. "I'm sending you down the street with some books. The name is Sharp." Calder grinned. Events were fitting together now with the precision of pentominoes. He ventured, "Would that be Louise Sharp?" Mr. Watch looked stern. "Yes, but not to you." He handed Calder a paper bag filled with books. On the way over, Calder peeked into the bag. There were some novels in French and a new book about art by David Hockney. It looked like the kind of thing Miss Husey would read. There was also a small beat-up book called An Experiment in Time. When Calder flipped to the table of contents, he saw that Chapter 2 was called The Puzzle. Mrs. Sharp must not be all bad. If she recognized Calder, she didn't let on. He decided not to remind her about the glass of water. Calder noticed that she had unusually green eyes, a sea green surrounded by lots of wrinkles and bones. She asked him to wait in the living room while she got a check. He looked around. He was standing on a huge oriental carpet. Velvet cushions, naked sculpture, glass cabinets. The place was a museum, and in the corner, on a neatly organized desk, sat a large, fancy computer. Then he saw it. Calder couldn't believe his eyes. There, hanging over the sofa, was a big version of the painting on his box. "Do you know what that is?" Her voice made him jump. "I was going to ask you. You see, my grandma gave me a box with that that painting on the cover, and I was going to try and find out who did it, and I just did some homework that describes it. That's so strange, isn't it?" Mrs. Sharp sniffed and handed Calder the check. "Well, not really. That's a print of the Vermeer painting called The Geographer. There must be thousands of them around." "Oh, who was Vermeer? I know I've heard his name, but, you know," Calder, still surprised, was warming up to the situation. "He was Dutch and painted in the 17th century." She paused, looking thoughtfully at Calder's enthusiastic grin. "I'm sure you could find a book in your school library that told you something about him." Wow, this is just so perfect. Calder, in his excitement, was already headed for the front door. Then he remembered Petra's book. "Hey, Mrs. Sharp, could I ask you a question? It's about Lowe, a book a friend of mine, Petra Andali, found at Powell's, and, well, I think maybe it has your name in it." Mrs. Sharp was dreadfully silent for a moment. What was she thinking? When she spoke, her voice was soft. "Do you understand the book?" Calder looked up. He couldn't tell from her face whether this was a trick question. "Part of it, anyway," he lied. "I mean, we both really like the stuff about weird things happening that nobody understands, like people who disappear, and it's cool that he found all that in newspapers." Here's a picture of the painting over Mrs. Sharp's couch. I didn't think anybody read books like that anymore. Mrs. Sharp looked almost human now. Encouraged, Calder blurted, "Oh, yes, all the time." Oh no, he'd gone too far. "Come for tea one day after school. Bring your friend and we will talk about Charles Fort." Mrs. Sharp's voice was now icy. 4 o'clock. She turned to open the door and Calder knew he was being dismissed. "Okay, I will. The door shut in his face. Calder walked back towards Powell's in a daze. My friend Petra? He hoped she would become his friend, and fast. There was no way he'd go back to talk about that low stuff on his own. How did he get himself into this? Monday morning was blue and white, and everything was blowing. Cumulus clouds, bare branches, scraps of rubbish. Calder stepped out his front door and saw Petra chasing a piece of paper up the block toward the Castiglionis. As he watched, the paper shot skyward in a graceful loop and headed over the roof of the Castiglionis' treehouse and toward the train tracks. Petra stopped. "Darn," she said. "That letter was half buried in your garden. I only got to read the beginning, but it said something about an old crime and art." She shrugged. "Probably just some crazy advertisement, anyway. Not a real letter at all." "I've been thinking about that Charles House book," Calder began. "Fort." Petra tried not to smile. "And something else." Calder took a deep breath. "Mrs. Sharp, that is her book. And she's interested that you, know about it. She wants to meet you." Petra has stopped walking. "Seriously?" "She wants us to have tea with her one day. She just kind of announced it." Calder looked at the tops of the trees as if they'd been invited too. What would he do if Petra wouldn't go? Mrs. Sharp would soon realize he'd lied about reading low. Petra was silent for a moment. "Wait, how did you talk to her?" Calder explained about his job at Powell's and the delivery yesterday. The rest of the walk to school they talked about coincidence, agreeing that it didn't always seem to be accidental, and Petra shared some of Charles Fort's ideas about looking carefully at things. Calder wanted to tell her about his box and about the coincidence of seeing the geographer on Mrs. Sharp's wall, but didn't. Miss Hussey hadn't read Calder's description aloud yet, and he was hoping Petra would like it. They agreed that there was a great deal to be figured out in the world. Petra confided that she thought Miss Hussey might be willing to let them collect strange data the way Fort did. That is, if kids like Denise didn't wreck it for everyone. "Maybe data about art. Art and unexplained stuff," Petra blurted. "Petra, you're amazing." How could he ever have thought that wedge of hair was anything but brainy? Petra's mouth twisted strangely. "You'd better read that book before you agree with me. You might not be as crazy as I am." He laughed and stirred the pentominoes in his pocket happily. This year was getting better all the time. Calder borrowed Petra's copy of Lowe that afternoon. She was right. Fort was an extraordinary thinker. He looked fearlessly at occurrences that no one could explain. Even better, he looked everywhere for patterns. Calder understood the man's fascination with connecting things that didn't seem related, and he admired the way Fort challenged the experts. How could Mrs. Sharp ever have gotten rid of such an exciting book? Speaking of Mrs. Sharp, he had some detective work to do. The reproduction of the geographer in his library book was clearer and brighter than the copy of the painting on his box. Behind the man was a framed map, and above that the signature I. Vermeer, and under that capital MDCLXVIII. Calder counted. 1,000 plus 500 plus 100 plus 50 plus 10 plus 5 plus 3, 1668. The artist's full name was Johannes Vermeer, also known as Jan Vermeer, and he was from the Netherlands in Northern Europe. The book explained that no one knew for sure who the geographer was, but that the area where Vermeer lived was a center for map makers. It talked about how people with money liked to hang maps on the walls of their houses to show that they were wealthy and that they thought about the world. Map making was a respected profession, something between a science and an art. Calder flipped back and forth in the book, looking at some of the other Vermeer paintings. Most of them showed people in front of a window. The geographer's rug appeared in many of the paintings, and the same yellow jacket turned up in a number of places. The pictures made you feel as though you were peeking in at someone else's private moment. The light that came from outside made ordinary objects seem important. A quill pen, a pitcher with milk, an earring, the brass buttons that were part of a straight-back chair. It occurred to Calder that there could be hidden information here. After all, codes involved repetition, and the same objects appeared again and again in Vermeer's work. There was the obvious geometry of window panes and floor tiles, and then all the pearls, baskets, pictures, and framed maps. There was symmetry, both complete and carefully broken. Calder read more. The book said that Vermeer died penniless when he was in his 40s, and that almost nothing was known about his life. No one understood why such a fabulous painter had made only 35 works of art. No one knew who the people he painted were, or why he painted the things he did. No one knew how he became an artist. Vermeer had left behind more questions than answers.